for the Maya section, like I said earlier, I would recommend checking the video I did last week. It should be in the VODs if you go under there on videos. That'll go over a lot of the posing in Maya, how to get that to look good. But dynamic weight and balance in Maya, the biggest thing to me when I'm trying to get those dynamic elements is trying to push the line of action and the overall force in your drawing. So that's kind of, or in your pose. So this is going to be the same concept in 2D as it is in CG, in 3D. So let's say you have a character, and I'm just going to, let's actually do this. No, let's just do simple drawings first. So let's say we have a character that's standing. A lot of times when I see animators start drawing or start posing their characters, a lot of times we're going to get poses like this, where the legs are just perfectly straight under the character and everything is kind of flat right through here. I'm just going to, what weird body proportions this character has. Very short legs. Normally legs should be like half the length, or about the same length as the rest of the body there. Excuse the drawings. I am a CG animator, not a 2D artist. So we'll get something like this. And this is not super interesting because the balance is just perfectly centered between these 2 feet. It's just not that interesting. It's very symmetrical and flat. So how do we make that more interesting? Well, first, we want to offset the balance point. So right now the balance point is right in between these 2 feet. Favor one foot versus the other. So if I do that, we'll just kind of take this body here and just move it to the side here. Just by doing this, suddenly that feels more dynamic right there. That feels like the character has more of an interesting dynamic balance. Now, let's actually, those legs are bothering me. I'm just going to scale them up a little bit here. There we go. So that creates the more dynamic interest. But now we've got this line of action that is just straight here and then bent here. We would want to push this and make that whole thing more dynamic. Now, we push this by pushing the weight into the hip here, and then we can add a contrapposto to the spine. So something like this. And now that body is going to be much more dynamic already. So now we've got that kind of going into there. We can push this in all sorts of different ways. I could push it the other way. So like that. And let's kind of straighten that out here. And then have that leg still out there, kind of on the toes. So we push things like that. And you can see how we're starting to push that dynamic angle. Now I'm going to extremes here with this bend right in there. But we can get much more interesting and dynamic poses by first pushing the weight to favor one side versus the other, and then using the body to add a curve to the whole thing. So that's going to be kind of the big start in there, and kind of the basis for a lot of the posing and trying to make it more dynamic, is that offset. Now, how do you push that even further? So how do we make that posing even more dynamic? Well, we exaggerate. So let me actually, I'm going to find a pose online here. And then we're going to do what I usually call an exaggeration pass. So let me, dynamic poses. Okay. So I talked about this in the last stream, but if ever you're looking at poses, something that can be very useful is just to go to Pinterest and just do a search for dynamic poses. So right here, we can find some poses with very cool dynamic lines through them. So let's find one that kind of works. I kind of like this one, but if we're going for balance, let's see. I just want to take one at random that, okay, this one. This one has a cool line of action. It's very dynamic. So I'm going to just take this here and move that off onto my other monitor. And let me save this here. So I just need to bring it in right there. There we go. So let's say I need to take this pose. It's in my reference. This is already a really dynamic pose. And I need to make this even stronger. I want to push that to be more dynamic. Well, this is where you want to do a master study. How can we exaggerate that? And what can we exaggerate so that we're not just breaking things? Well, if we take a look at this here, and let me pick a color that is a little bit more clear. Draw on the right layer. So if we take a look at this here, what we see is this very dynamic line of action, this contrapposto right in here, and this beautiful flow right through in that bottom leg compared to this front leg right there. So you can see how that back leg is really just pushing that line of action all the way through into the heel here. And we get this nice contrast with the head right there. So again, this is a really powerful pose already. There's not going to be too much that we can push in here without starting to break things, but we can still try. So you can see, there we go. That's pretty much the basics of that pose right in there. The broken down structure, and then the back foot is like there. Well, how can we push this? Once again, for me, a lot of this is the line of action. The line of action right now is kind of going through right through there, like that. And if you look at this, it's overall kind of even. Now, what I mean by that is, let's draw this out here again and pull it out to the side. See how the line is, if I draw a straight line here, it's kind of symmetrical from the top here down to the bottom there. It's kind of like a bow and arrow, a bow being pulled back. Now, is that bad? Not at all. But this is a sign that I could exaggerate this a little bit more. And what I'm going to be using here is what I usually call line weight. Now, just as a side here, there's two types of line weights when we're usually talking in art. Line weight is usually defined as the thickness of the line over time. So this is a thin line weight, thick line weight. So that's one term for line weight. The other one is the directionality of a curve. So imagine you've got a rubber band that's stuck between two pins right here. So you've got two pins and you've put a rubber band between them like that. Now you take that rubber band and you pull it straight up. You're going to get something like this between those two pins. Okay, well, that's one curve, and this is that bow and arrow kind of curve that we're getting. But what if you take that and pull it to the side? Suddenly you've got that. It's still the same curve, a C shape right through here, just exaggerated in a specific way. I could also pull it back the other way, like this. And I can pull it around, and I can exaggerate it. That's what we can do here. So if I look at this curve, it's kind of flat right there. But what if I really want to put a lot of the force into this shoulder and just have him like he's about to swing through, and I want him to like feel like he's just going to bash someone in the head with his arm? Well, I could push that line weight, that line of action weight in here to be more like that. Now more of that energy is being pushed up through here versus just kind of straight out like that. What if I wanted to really have the feeling of his hips leading the action so that we get that hip lead and then the arm swing? I could push the line of action to be more like this. Now it's pulling further out on that lower end right through there. And I could even lower it even more right here. And now it's kind of pulling down in that direction. So by pushing your line weight in there, you can get a more dynamic pose. And then from there, you can just push, again, that balance. So in this case, his balance point would be kind of this foot here. And you can see he's very far off balance. Well, that's okay because he's got momentum. So in this case, I don't really have to worry too much about my balance. So let's try to push this line here. So I'm going to push that line a little bit higher here and kind of straighten it out there. And let's actually really push that in here. So we get that nice diagonal in there. So from there, I can start to really push the body through here. So I want to get that nice straight line in here. That shoulder is leading through there. The head, I can still kind of keep angled this way. A little low there. Something like that. And then if I wanted to push this, I can push that leg a little bit straighter back here. And then let's just really push that twist and have that leg coming through with more force right through there. So we can do something like that. Push this arm further back here. And then the other arm, let's just really push this kind of forward. And if I drag this hand back here, we're going to get more lead with the chest and kind of the elbow. So he's kind of leading through here. So this is pretty much the same pose, but you can see how that's going to be much more dynamic now. Right through there as the character is coming through. And it's really just taking that line of action and exaggerating it and putting more force into that direction, putting it into a focus versus just that general line. The other thing that can often help is looking at the center points of your body. So if I look at the center point of his head here, center point of his neck, so usually look at the center of the clavicles here, and then center of his hips. See how that curve? One, it's not too much of a curve. It's almost just a straight line. And two, it's just slightly bent. Even though this pose is amazingly dynamic, those center points kind of line up to each other and aren't the most dynamic overall. But if we look at my other drawing here, those center points, you can see how that line is much more angled. That makes it feel more dynamic. There's more momentum in there. So this is something to always watch, is those points, because we as humans have the tendency to want to line things up in a straight vertical line. And you could have the most dynamic pose, let's say this one here, but if I line this up like so, where all of these just are straight vertical over top of each other, suddenly that pose doesn't feel as dynamic. It kind of feels a little flatter compared to that, where it has more momentum. So if your pose is supposed to be moving forward and it's supposed to have energy, we want the whole thing to feel like there's energy. So those are kind of the main elements. It's pushing characters off of a perfectly balanced point, even for a standing pose, and then trying to push that line of action and push the weight of the line through there. And that can be really, really useful. So that's one thing that I would recommend. So hopefully that helps. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's see. Now I feel like his chest is leading. Could we have done something different to push the line of action? So for the drawing here, yeah, we definitely could. So if we wanted, for example, let's just take all of this and have the stomach lead. Let's just do that because we talked about it a little bit before. So I'm going to do it a smaller drawing here. Let's say we want the hips to be leading right in there. I would push that line of action. So it's kind of a little bit lower here. And now I can push those hips to kind of lead the action right through there. Shoulders coming through. It's twisting. So something like that. So now it feels like if you had a javelin here instead of a sword, it feels like he's winding up for that kind of throw, versus here where he's leading with his chest and we're getting more of that swinging action right through here. And I could get more of that swinging action by pushing the arm further back this way around. So we get that feeling of the arm kind of pulling back and opening up his chest here. So now it's pretty much, again, it's that same C curve. It's all a C curve, C, C, C. But instead of just keeping it that bow and arrow curve, I'm just exaggerating the line weight to push what's going to lead the action, what's going to make it feel more dynamic. So I hope that makes sense right there. So this is where you can push your reference and you're not changing things per se. You're not recreating your reference from scratch and just throwing everything out the window, but you're exaggerating things to make your poses feel more unique to what you need, especially as animators. We are not always the best actors. So our animations, or our reference, I should say, can kind of be stiff a lot of the times. So by doing this, we can push our shots to just be more dynamic and get that lead and follow. That's a little bit more interesting. Not only that, but it allows us to animate things more interestingly as well. So for example, we often try to reverse a curve. So you're going to have a curve in your animation. Let's say you have a C. Well, then we want to go into a reversal. Okay, now it's a reverse C. And we'll have like an S curve in the middle. Ooh, look at how dynamic that is. Cool. And then you do that over and over and over. Well, if you do it too often, your character is just going to do this. And it just feels very boring, or from front to back. It gets very annoying. And your character just wiggles around on screen. But what we can also do is just animate the curve weight. So for example, if I have this here, let's bring in my timeline. And I'm just going to animate the curve here, kind of moving up. So it's all going to be a C curve right through here. So all of these would be a C curve. But now if we look at this, you get that sense of motion in there. Right in there. There we go. So we've got a C curve and it still feels dynamic. So you can have a character who's standing there and then they just kind of straighten up and you're just pushing that curve through their body. And that can be interesting to look at versus always just reversing the character fully all the time. Now, this is a very basic example. There's a curve moving across. But if you go from like here to here, you could have a big change of a character where this would be kind of a character just slouching and then what the heck? And they stand up and have more of that presence to them right there. Kind of vulture hanging down, like, what the heck? Angry eyes. Compared to this, where it's just slouched over. Everything's just hanging. So, hopefully that all makes sense.